Let's cross the Tasman now, where a banking royal commission has claimed its first high-profile scalp. It's an unprecedented inquiry, this one, a knock 'em down, hang 'em high, revelatory embarrassment for Australia's banking sector, especially that country's biggest banks. Opposed at first by many in the banking business and political establishment, it's now providing a compelling insight into behaviour so unethical that the chief executive of AMP, Craig Meller, today stepped down over revelations of board-level deception, or lying in plain English, and misappropriation of funds. Earlier this week, a nurse gave tearful testimony about losing her home after taking advice from Westpac, while lawyers presented evidence that the Commonwealth Bank of Australia knowingly charged dead clients fees for years. Now, Madeleine Mattera is a partner and national head of financial services at Thornton in Australia. While she obviously works in the financial sector, she does not have clients before the Commission. I spoke to her earlier this afternoon.
There's certainly quite a number of areas where the conduct has been around how the big four banks can maximise their revenue streams, and very little regard to the consumer or the customer, whichever term you wish to use. And I think there's a lot of consideration that really needs to be given at the big end of town around how incentives and remuneration actually drive behaviour and drive the sort of outcomes that we've been hearing about in the media.
Yeah, a quote from The Guardian: "We've heard evidence of appalling behaviour by Australia's major banks, including alleged bribery, forged documents, repeated failure to verify customers' living expenses before lending them money, and mis-selling insurance to people who can't afford it." Some of this is opportunism, in other words, people who are incentivised on commission trying to earn more money. Some of it kind of reeks of pre-GFC recklessness.
I think the driver, as far as I can see, is really about two things. It's about culture and governance. And culture and governance actually allow the remuneration and incentive structures that we see that drive bad behaviour, but also the culture and governance that make it very hard to detect and forestall the sort of practices that we've seen. And it also makes it very difficult for anybody who speaks up to get heard.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? It wasn't a culture of whistleblowing. And as the extent of it emerges, you have the Treasurer, Scott Morrison, warning wrongdoers could face jail. That's how serious these things are, he's saying. This is extraordinary.
It very much is, and personally I don't think that the current legislation actually allows the jailing of banking executives, but I think that's he's certainly raised the stakes somewhat, and it remains to be seen how this plays out. But I think what ScoMo is articulating is the horror at how widespread a number of the conduct failings that we've heard have been, and it's not just one organisation. I think there's I did hear some talk today about that whilst Commonwealth Bank actually had the gold medal in terms of egregious behaviour uncovered by the Royal Commission, AMP got the silver medal, and that's not great when we're talking Olympic-style proportions of conduct failures within the major banks. But I will point out that it's very interesting to see that this is happening in the major banks. And I deal with a lot of small and mid-sized financial institutions, such as credit unions and mutual banks. And I have to say that the organisations that I work with are really looking on developments in the Royal Commission with some degree of horror to see what actually goes on in the big four banks that actually are supposedly the trusted brand names in Australian society.
And it really does seem to be the big four. I mean, you mentioned AMP, obviously, but the people who are looking baddest of all, for want of a better description, and I apologise for that appalling English, are the big players.
That's true, and I think this is an output of the phenomenon of vertically integrated financial institutions, which is a slightly euphemistic way of saying banks who own life insurance companies, general insurance companies, financial planning arms, and funds management arms. And hence are looking for a maximum share of the of wallet from their customer.
and they can get away with almost anything because everything is in-house.
Look, that is true, and the concept of conflicts of interest is really getting an airing in the Royal Commission, and that's certainly something that is a real issue in these the diversified financial institutions with that feature of vertical integration that I mentioned earlier. Because if you as an average consumer walk into a Big Four bank's financial planning arm, you actually stand a fairly sizable chance of being sold only products that are manufactured by that bank or a related entity of that bank, and not necessarily having the opportunity even to consider or invest in something that may be offered by one of their competitors, for example.
Yeah.
And I don't know that the average consumer really actually understands the potential for conflicts of interest and how that might actually impact their interests.
Madeleine, as all of this comes out, and it's starting now to disappear from the business pages and end up on the front pages, can you describe the procedure itself? It's obviously unprecedented, this commission, this inquiry. What is it like? It must be absolutely compelling as it unfolds.
Indeed it is, and myself and a number of my colleagues and a number of individuals I deal with in client organisations are watching it on their laptops a lot through live streaming during their working day. It is there was some commentary that it was actually better than reality television. Possibly that view is not shared by the witnesses appearing in front of the Royal Commission, but it is very much almost a US-style televised courtroom, which is quite unprecedented in Australia. And the nature of a Royal Commission into a particular industry, being banking, superannuation and financial services, is, as I understand it, somewhat unprecedented in the Western world. So we are very much breaking new ground in Australia, but the nature of the proceedings is well worth looking at because it is very much an adversarial style courtroom procedure, and the Commissioner and Senior Counsel Rowena Orr are doing a stellar job of airing the misconduct issues.
Madeleine Mattera, who was a partner with Grant Thornton in Sydney, obviously watching with eyes wide open. This is extraordinary. New Zealand's biggest four banks all have Australian parents, of course. There are different banking laws and regulations in New Zealand, but in future programs of Checkpoint, we'll look at some of the most common practices being identified by the Royal Commission and ask, are they happening here? That to come on Checkpoint.